Hello, Baker graduate economics students. So hope everyone had a good week and having a good weekend. We're just about wrapping up week one, so kind of an exciting week with the election. Actually, the election or post-election, once Biden is in office, really applies to some of the things that we're going to be looking at in Chapter 4 and 5. Kind of dealing with the idea of how the government intervenes in markets to try to correct externalities and some of the different tactics that they may use. This week you're going to be reading chapters 4 and 5. Continue to jump in with the forum discussion, jump in early. Make sure to make one post to appear by Saturday, and then, your initial post by Thursday, a post to appear, at least one post to appear by Saturday, and then another post at a minimum to appear by Sunday. Just making the post by Saturday just gives appear a little bit more time to respond to any comments that you may have. So good job with the forum discussion too. This week I was able to jump in and respond to at least everyone. I don't know that I'll be able to do that every week, so I may pick and choose some weeks if it gets a little bit busy. But you're doing a great job, so just make sure to look at the forum discussion rubric if you're looking at that. And then for this week, in addition to the readings, make sure you do the quizzes. I know notice there's still some people that you kind of jump in and get in that My Econ Lab. These aren't hard quizzes, but just make sure that you do get in there and do get it completed. You have the opportunity to get 100% if you have multiple attempts on it. So anyway, for this week, kind of looking at chapter 4, we'll talk about that first. The idea of consumer and producer surplus. First with consumer surplus, this was actually thought of not by an economist, by a French engineer who pondered how much people would pay to go over a toll road before they would take a longer route. His name was Charles Dupuy. And the way we applied it in economics is that we look at it as, if you think underneath the demand curve, it's kind of like that little triangle. We can measure that area of a triangle by kind of our basic math of 1/2 of base times height, looking at the distance between the price and the highest price that somebody's willing to pay and the equilibrium price and quantity in the market. So consumer surplus is the benefit that a consumer receives above and beyond what the price they actually paid. So if you were willing to pay, let's say that $4 for a Big Mac, and it was only $3, you had $1 of consumer surplus. Okay, so there are benefits to the consumer. And later when we look at markets and pricing decisions, one of the goals is through price discrimination, which is legal depending on situations, to try to charge different prices to different consumers. Airlines are one example of this. It's very common in this industry. Although you're just really going from point A to B, there might be different types of services. And even in the textbook and some of your reading, you'll read about whether you would pay extra space to have not have the person behind you lean their chair back, or you're trying to do work. So often you see those incentives when you go to the airport and they ask you, do you want to bump up to a more expensive seat? So they're trying to capture more of that consumer surplus. But on the producer surplus side, I want you to think of it as the area above the supply curve and below the price. So it's that triangle too. But in terms of the concerns is if there's a market that's not in equilibrium, there can be what we call deadweight loss. So it's that the consumer doesn't get that area and the producer doesn't get that area. So it's a shift, and that's what you're going to be reading about. And some of the common examples in markets that you'll read about in that chapter are what are called price floors and price ceilings. It's an attempt by either local or federal governments or state governments to try to correct what they view as a market failure. And this can be controversial too. I remember years ago watching a 60-minute special on the Samoan Islands where there were some canning factories, the tuna canning factories, and they felt that the minimum wage was not the same minimum wage as the federal minimum wage in the United States, and they wanted to raise it. And the tuna factories warned them that if you did this, we will simply go somewhere else in another nation. And sure enough, they raised the minimum wage, and then all it did was end up with higher unemployment rates on the islands. So although they had good intentions, and I think that's sometimes too with state or local or federal governments, they're not really understanding all the economic situation all the time. So you have to kind of really examine the markets and understand, like, if you do put in a $15 minimum wage, what does this do? Obviously it's going to benefit the individuals that can receive the $15 per hour wage, but if the market equilibrium wage is only $10, and the say local city does not have the ability to change that, it could mean that certain firms decide not to produce or shut down there or move somewhere else. So although you've tried to help the situation, you've actually made things worse off. So it's just, policy is important, and that's what will be interesting to see how things change, both good and bad, about what is the best thing. And that's where economists like to give their opinions about what is the best policy, or understanding markets in order to apply those policies. So you're going to look at different things like tax incidents, who bears the burden of a tax, whether we should be taxing e-cigarettes right now, or taxing, drinking soda, and typically a lot of what we talk about the syntax is if your demand curve is very, almost, what we call like perfectly inelastic, that means if you apply a tax that the tax is going to be borne mostly on the consumer. So states typically tax those things such as liquor, such as cigarettes, gasoline, that they know that demand is very inelastic. We'll talk about that more later, but that means that consumers are going to pay it no matter what happens to the price increase, can help them raise revenue. So it's kind of this double-edged sword that you're trying to eliminate something that you believe is a negative externality. And let me explain negative and externality. A negative externality is a byproduct or something that happens in a market. And it doesn't even necessarily mean that you are consuming the goods. So common ones are like pollution. It could be, healthcare, obesity, and those things. So you're trying to correct something. Other ones could be, that you want to try to create a positive externality. Higher education is a good example of that. Do you give merit-based aid? Do you give need-based aid? How do you shift the demand curve out for higher education? And, for some of you, I'm sure you're taking out student loans, but are those loans subsidized? Are you getting any aid? How does that influence your decision to go to school? So you'll examine those things in the markets. And then last with chapter 5, as we kind of continue this, and let me just kind of say one more thing about externalities. It's that if markets left on their own, they're not producing the socially optimal level. And when you see these shifts in a demand or supply curve in these chapters, what they're showing you is a shift in the demand or supply curve based on the amount of that tax. So almost like think about is that as this curve is intersecting your price axis, the amount of the curve is shifting by the amount of that tax too. So I just want to kind of remind you about that. But in the last chapter, it talks about more, these idea of like transaction cost, and if there are low transactions costs, and they kind of so Cose's theorem that if they're low, parties will work their way out to try to figure out, an ideal situation in market. People will be willing to trade off and get to what we would consider, it'd have to be kind of a decision as a whole, what is best for our economy, best for society. But how we allocate these goods and services, and the textbook's going to go into discussion about the difference between public goods and private goods. You're going to be going discussion whether something is rival or non-rival, and excludable or not excludable. And even on page 165, they give you some examples there. So like a Big Mac, it will be both rival and excludable. It's you that's consuming that good. Once you consume it, nobody else can consume it. But a public good, be it a public park or a national defense or police force, you get the benefit of the good even if you don't pay the taxes. So but it's open to other ones. But it also kind of brings about these problems. When it gave the examples of something like, tuna in the ocean. I gave you my tuna fish example already. But one of the concerns is, that our planet does have a finite amount of resources. If the oceans are open to everyone, or, if we're going into different areas of land and taking away all those resources or polluting those resources, that's kind of more the social concerns is, things can look bleak if you continue to eat away at all those resources. And as the world population is growing and growing, there's a famous economist, classic one called Robert Malthus. He was the Chicken Little of economist, if you will, because he's always kind of like the sky is falling. But he was worried about food. That food was growing at an arithmetic rate, population was growing at an exponential rate, and someday we were going to run out of food. But what he failed to consider was the advent of technology and how we were able to produce more food. Today, it's not a matter of that we can't produce the food; it's just distributing to the people and the efficiencies in market. I'd probably argue in the United States we throw away a lot of food. So how do you correct those type of externalities, or making decisions whether we should be producing corn for food or corn for ethanol? So that's what a lot of this chapter looks at, and why it's important to you all to kind of tie this all together is because it impacts your decisions. It impacts how you vote, how you want society to be, and then ultimately from a business decision, which many of you are in, how are we going to allocate resources, or how are we going to react to decisions in markets? So for the last, I'll wrap it up with this. My sister, she years ago used to live in San Diego, used to manage all these tanning salons, and would manage. She would mention like these different girls would come in, like 18, 19-year-olds, work at them. And I think California imposed a tanning tax. And the purpose of the tax was, they're concerned about the safety and health. And she explained, well, Joe, a lot of these, they do these spray tans now. And I kind of just joked because, like, you're in California. Why do you need to pay to get tan? But anyway, I asked her, would that affect her business? She goes, nah, people are going to pay for this no matter what. So, but for other businesses, whether they're taxed or if they're given subsidies, it can definitely influence their markets. And that's why, oftentimes you'll have people in different businesses that work together and lobby and try to influence policy. So anyway, I want you all to have a great week. And if you do have any questions, do send me an email. But jump in early to the forum discussion, and I look forward to talking to you all online. Take care and have a great week.